Welcome to another episode of Crown Jewels on PLD Projects. I'm your host, PLD, and this is the show where we look at every Queen track, every solo track in mostly chronological order, and determine which version of the track is the crown jewel the best, because Queen is known for making all sorts of different track versions, whether it be single edits, whether it be demos, whether it be remixes, whether it be live versions. Always something to talk about for the most part. And then after that, we'll go into where it ranks on my list. Does it sit my top 10? Where does the album fit in? All this, it's all going to happen in a short amount of time. Some episodes are longer than others. I will say this episode might be a little longer than what we've had the past couple of weeks. The past couple of weeks we were left with two tracks that had no other alternative versions, so it was pretty quick to get through. But not this week. This week we are delving into Ogre Battle, yes. It's one of the songs I always point to. If someone ever says that Queen was not a heavy rock band, not a heavy metal band, that they're more of a pop band, I mean, they were all over the map. But this is a song that proves that they can rock them out with the big boys, that it is really prototype for heavy metal, to be honest with you. But let's get into a little bit of the background of it before we start listening to it and the alternative versions, which include a BBC session, which include a 1991 Hollywood remix, which include a standalone version that was used for a compilation. We can also talk about 4 different live versions we got to tackle this week. Like I said, this one's a little bit more to take in. Of course, all those links are going to be down below in the description, so you can listen along when I get to those moments. But let's start off with a little bit of background here. Written by Freddie Mercury, this is what opens up the so-called black side of the Queen 2 album, as it was divided into a white side and a black side. Of course, the white side had been written by Brian May and the one Roger Taylor track. The black side is completely a Freddie Mercury composition, mostly delving into some of his more mythological feels. Not too lyrically a lot different than what he would do in the 80s. This was very much Lord of the Rings and Led Zeppelin-esque in a way, always diving into mystical mountains. And of course, I mean, the very title of this track alone, Ogre Battle, screams, Lord of the Rings, which was very popular at the time in the 70s. Again, musicians on this, we got Freddie on lead vocals, backing vocals, and some screams in there. Brian had guitars and backing vocals. John did the bass. And of course, Roger Taylor doing the drums, the gong, backing vocals, and some more screams. Yes, there's a lot of screaming in this, and screams were considered a musical instrument. So that's what we have here. So Ogre Battle was actually written before the first album and considered to be on the first album at one point. It was left off due to it not quite fitting the theme, I guess you would say. But it was played live as early as 1972, and it was played live all the way through 1976, and sporadically in 1977. Hasn't been played for a while, but at the end of the 70s was a real crowd favorite. We're going to hear some of those versions later on. And before we listen to it, I have 2 quotes I'll read you from Brian May talking about the track. First one from 1998. Freddie also wrote Ogre Battle, which is a very heavy metal guitar riff. It's strange that he should have done that, but when Freddie used to pick up a guitar, he'd have a great frenetic energy. It was like a very nervy animal playing the guitar. He was a very impatient person and was very impatient with his own technique. He didn't have a great technical ability on the guitar, but he had it in his head, and you could feel the stuff bursting to get out. His right hand would move incredibly fast. He wrote a lot of good stuff for guitar. A lot of it was stuff which I would not have thought of because it would be in weird keys. He had this penchant for playing in E flat and A flat and E. These are not places that your hand naturally falls on when you're playing the guitar, so he forced me into finding ways of doing things which made unusual sounds. It was really good. Of course, Brian May interview with Guitar World in 1998. He talked to Guitar Player in 2008, so that was a bit of a miracle, actually. They had this massive gong in the studio that Roger hit. When we turned the tape over, the gong sounded great backwards, and that sound was going to be at the beginning of the track. That got us wondering what the rest of the track would sound like backwards. Well, it sounded very similar. The riff is palindromic. It sounds the same forwards and backwards in the intro, and then we seamlessly crossfaded it with the forward track. I don't think it's even a crossfade. I think it's a butt edit, and you can't even tell. I used my fingerboard pickup and bridge pickup out of phase for that tone. So there you have it. 2 quotes from Brian May talking about how Freddie wrote the track. Also, the great studio tomfoolery they had with the sounds and recording things and playing them backwards. You can tell right away from the intro. There's a gong intro that kind of plays. It sets the mood quite well, not only for the song, but for all of the side black. But you know what? I'm done talking about it for now. Let's listen to it. Then we'll come back and talk about it. The studio version of Ogre Battle from the album Queen 2. Here we go. And And there you have it. What a rocker. What a just a flat out rocker. I love it. It starts off, like I mentioned before, with a gong and a guitar riff that's reversed. Kind of a cool, moody intro that was playing it forwards and backwards, which of course builds with this big screaming ah, and the fast riff that Brian was talking about, that really frenetic energy that Freddie wrote on. Brian's obviously playing it. It's a really fast riff, and there's always almost a big choir somewhere throughout. I love that part of it. I will say Freddie's voice remains very melodic. It's all these screams are generally background noise, as if in a battlefield, which really comes into play during that middle instrumental section. There's kind of like almost a chaotic feel during that middle section. A lot of riffs going through, a lot of screaming going on in the background, but it just sounds like a real battlefield. It's kind of an awesome build. Of course, when we get there, though, Freddie's voice is very melodic, very powerful sounding, still fast and rhythmic punching sound. It's really great. The middle slows down a little bit at one point, becomes more of an earthy, crunchy affair, kind of a breakdown moment in there before that big instrumental section I was talking about. One thing I noticed during this track is a lot of great runs by Brian to go with Freddie's vocals. He does that a lot. Brian tends to try to play along with Freddie in a way, adding a little extra riff behind it. It's always kind of a nice element that adds that extra layer to it. And of course, the ending is this big riff-a-rama, like the beginning. It comes to a big thunderclap type finale, which on the album version, you don't really hear as much, kind of cuts it off. It does lead directly into the next track. We do have one earlier on that's a standalone version. We'll listen to that later on. But it's a great introduction there to this song. I hope you like it as much as I do. Let me know. Let me know what you feel about this song. But before we go any further, let's go listen to the next version, the alternative release version from the BBC, from session number 3. But I will say there are different versions even of session number 3 from over the years. There was originally was recorded, there was a additional intro, a little guitar intro, very moody piece with stabs of guitar. Unfortunately, it was lost over the years because the tape was damaged. It did surface later on in bootleg form, but it was very poor quality and never really sounded great. So even when they tried to mix it up together, it didn't work. When they did release the On Air album, which is the most definitive BBC album we have from Queen. We also had Queen at the Beam, Queen at the BBC were basically the same album for the UK and the US. We had a more complete version called On Air, which was released much later on. And this one had a little bit more than what the other albums had released. So it was kind of like a partially fixed version. It's still not the complete intro, but still pretty cool. So, but without further ado, let's listen to that and see what we find different or the same. Well, there you have it, the BBC session from session number 3. What do you think about that one? That was definitely a different feel. I mentioned, like, again, the intro is a little different, obviously, because they didn't have the studio trickery. I mean, they were doing more of a live take in the studio at the BBC. So more of a moody intro with some guitar playing and some drum riff and everything else. No more backwards and forward playing, just kind of a little bit of a riff here and there just to kind of intro the piece. And then it gets into it right away with a much more raw sound from Brian. I'm not sure if that was intentional or not, but his guitar sounds a lot more raw, a lot more heavier in this way. I also think the other big takeaway from this version is the backing vocals that have much more echo reverb on it, making it far more haunting sounding, very ghost-like in a way, very choir, is very haunting in this one. The version also features a much more relaxed Freddie here. He doesn't seem to be as intense. I don't know if he's saving his voice because it's live in the studio. I'm not sure what it is. It's not a bad take at all. I do think that the studio version feels a little more got more of an urgency to it, if you'd like. I do think we get a more defined bass from John here, a little bit more standing out than what's on the album version. And of course, we got a more standalone ending as well. Obviously, not going to go into the next track. A little more chaotic, a little bit of a randomness, almost like a band almost falling apart sound at the end, although it's not really, it's just kind of them playing a few tracks here and there, little bits here and there before it kind of ends. But it's a cool version. Definitely a cool version. Definitely something to look out for. Okay, we have one more official studio version we're going to listen to before we get into the live versions. I did mention before we had the Deep Cuts standalone version. I did include that in the description below. I'm not going to talk about it much, as all it really does is have a more full standalone ending with the gong at the end of the studio version that takes out. Don't have to worry about the Fairy Feller Masterstroke that goes into on the album. It's just a standalone version, so not really much else to talk about. There is one more track to talk about though, and that is the 1991 Hollywood remix from Nicholas Sansano. Now, just a quick aside, in 1991, the U.S. Hollywood Records, that's the U.S. label for Queen, they did re-release the catalog, and they included a lot of remixes on their albums. They all had bonus tracks on them. A few were B-sides, a few were, there's a couple oddities here and there, but most of them had these 1991 remixes by different producers. I'll be honest with you, I'm not a big fan of most of them. They're more dancey, clubby versions. They don't kind of like serve the album much in a way. I mean, I don't mind dancey, clubby versions. In fact, Made in Heaven has a track called You Don't Fool Me With. They did a lot of dance remixes on like singles and stuff. This kind of felt like it was just thrown on there just for the hell of it. But some of them are more interesting than others. This one from Nicholas Sansano, again, who has worked with Sonic Youth and Public Enemy. We're going to listen to that one. It's not a bad one in comparison to some of the other ones. But we'll listen to it first, and then we'll come back and talk about it. So yeah, to be honest, it's been a long time since I really listened to that version, and this time through, I kind of dug it. I don't know about you. I know I made a bad rep about the 1991 Hollywood remixes. Some of them are garbage. We're going to get to a few of them that I don't think I'll have a change of heart on. This one actually is pretty solid overall, because generally speaking, this leaves the song intact for the most part. It adds a few effects to strip away a few things, which is what the best remixes do, is make it a whole different song. You don't want a whole different song. You want something that feels at least similar to what we have. This has some interesting moments in it. Obviously, some more playful in the beginning with the screams throughout. The interesting section that I'm not sure if I like or dislike. I can't really tell. There's the it gets that cut off of that like electronic wing sound. It's kind of weird. I don't know if I like it, but I'll let it go. There are some added drums throughout, which actually do work a little bit. They kind of amplify some of Roger's stuff. They add some different riffs than Roger had. They do work for the most part. If nothing else, then they're not distractingly, or they actually support the song, which I like. There's some guitar bits that are added, which don't work quite as well, especially during the breakdown section. There's kind of weird sounding, like, squealy guitar I don't like. But the instrumental section, it does make it almost a different feel of a song. It's much more melodic. There's some backing vocals in the background there. Where else are you going to put backing vocals? Yeah, backing vocals in the background. Great job, PLD. But there's also some added guitar here, which makes for a very more interesting section. Not more interesting, but very interesting. More melodic, less chaos kind of going along with it. So at the end of the day, this is not a bad remix, I have to say. Where is it going to place on my list? I'm not sure yet. I have to go back through and listen to everything else. But you could definitely do worse than this 1991 Hollywood remix. All right, let's move on. Let's move on to the unreleased versions, which we talked about briefly. The only unreleased version we have is, we gotta assume, because this was written for the first album, that was probably demoed at some point. Maybe not, because they had less time. They didn't have a lot of time to work on it. Maybe they decided never to really demo it. But I gotta wonder if there's a Queen Sessions demo either before or after. It'd be interesting to hear about that. I don't know for sure. But that's it there. That's the only unreleased version we have known about anyway. Let's now get into the live versions. We have 4 officially released live versions. Live on the Golders Green from the On Air album, the BBC. We have 2 versions from the Rainbow, one from March 74, one from November of 74. And of course, the Night at the Hammersmith Odeon, to be precise, from 1975. I'll listen to the Golders Greer one first, then we'll tackle the 2 Rainbow ones together, then we'll close it out with the Night at the Odeon, and then we'll see which is the crown jewel. First up, like I said, the Golders Green. And there you have it, live at the Golders Green from the On Air album. You had a longer intro, more than we would have heard on the BBC session, obviously, with no studio trickery. They got to introduce the version a little bit differently. I do love the drum sound here. Roger's really pounding those drums. I love that. Freddie's voice is a little raw. It feels like he's still kind of working on lyrics a little bit. Not quite sure. Seems like a few times where Either he may have stumbled or was trying something different, but mostly it's still the same. Obviously, this is before it was recorded for the album by this point. Also, the backing vocals are not really audible in the beginning. There's not a lot going on. You hear Freddie, especially that first is all Freddie pretty much. They do, as the track goes on, do like turn the mics or something. I don't know, but they do. By the end, they are much more clearer. But in the beginning, like I said, it's not very audible. It's interesting to hear, though, I will say. Might also be that there's just only one Brian, no overdubbing, but because of that, John is also, again, far more audible here and really like leads the breakdown section, allowing Brian to be more moody, stabbing with guitars. It's an interesting version to hear for that reason alone. And of course, it ends more clearly again with the drums after the final choir, before, of course, the famous gong was brought onto the stage for the later tours, so they had to end with a quick drum fill and a final little guitar bit there at the end. So interesting version. Definitely interesting version hearing it. A little rawer, a little more undeveloped, not quite where we would be at the studio album. Of course, all the other officially released live versions are after the recording, definitively after the recording, so that's much more of a different take on them. So this is definitely probably the most unique live version we have. But let's move on. We're going to listen to both Rainbow, March 1974, and November 1974, and we'll compare and contrast those two before we move on to the final Night at the Odeon. And there we go with the two versions from Live at the Rainbow. I will spoil my little rankings a little bit here. I do definitely prefer one version over another here. The one I like better is the March 1974 version. Both have the similar intro, but both actually have a much more confident Freddie playing to the crowd a bit. I do love the March 74 version when they stop. What do you think of the show so far? Very Freddie-like, very fun, very energetic. Some very strong backing vocals in the March version. The energy is very frenetic. I love Roger's fills in this, especially at the end. There's this great big drum ending with it. Throughout, Roger's probably one of Roger's stronger performances of the songs, and this is definitely in this version of it. Brian's great, John's great. The reason I don't like the November one quite as much, I'm not sure if it's me or what it is, but it feels a little less urgent. It's a slightly slower tempo in the beginning. It does speed up a little bit, but the breakdown also seems more slower and deliberate. I'm not sure if it was a deliberate choice or if it was just the way the band felt at the time, but I felt that it lost a little something in this one. Still not a bad version by any sense of the imagination, but if we're going to pick one over the other, it's going to be March for me. Well, finally, let's listen to the 1975 version from the album Night at the Odeon, December of 1975, the famous Christmas show that Queen put on. The last track we will listen to tonight before we go on to the rest of the show. Here it is, 1975. Well, after listening to 4 different versions now of the live versions of the track, it's come to there's not a whole lot different in this version. I will say this is probably the tightest the band sounds. They definitely are they're hitting on all cylinders now, having performed this song for quite a few years now. The bass is really thumping. Roger's drums are really powerful. I will say probably the best Brian of all the versions. He definitely takes a lot more risks because he has that strong basis. Freddie's voice is in great form. Not quite as playful as it could be as the March 1974 version, which I think I might end up leaning towards. We'll have to see. Think about that now before as I move on to the next section. But this is a very, very fine version. So now let's move on to which is the crown jewel. Of course, how we do this is I take them and I'll give you a little bit of ranking. I'll go from my least favorite to the top favorite, which is the crown jewel I will be putting on my playlist. And now let's do that. Alrighty, here it is. Coming in at number 7 on my list, Live at the Rainbow, November 1974. What? Better than the 1991 Hollywood remix beats the Live at the Rainbow, November 1974? It does for me a little bit because while the Live at the Rainbow, November of 1974 is great, that's the slower tempo hurts it, meaning I would prefer to listen to the 1991 Hollywood remix, if only because there's some differences in there, which are kind of fun and exciting to listen to overall. They're probably about the same, either as far as what's actually better or not, but this ranking, November 1974, comes in 7th. So as you guessed it probably, number 6 is that 1991 Hollywood remix. Because remixes are very rarely going to be high up on my list because they're not usually Queen involved. So I feel like there's a little bit of a taint to it in my eyes. I don't know. Sometimes the remixes do great. So you might hear a few that make it up there, that bump it up. But in this case, it's a good version, but I'd rather listen to the other versions that are above it any day of the week. Coming in next at number 5, Get Live at the Golders Green. A little bit raw, a little bit not quite there yet, which is the reason why it fall below some of the other ones. Definitely a great version to listen to, no problems with it, but that'd be why it's number 5. Number 4, BBC Session number 3. I do like the BBC Session. There's a lot like the live versions, but it's a live version without a crowd, really. So, like, at the same time, it's kind of like, well, if I'm going to listen to this kind of version, I'd rather hear the live version with the crowd interplay. You know what I'm saying? So that's where that comes in. Number 4. Number 3, we got the Hammersmith 1975 gig. I didn't have much to say about it. It is very polished, I said. Probably the most polished live version we have. A lot of cool stuff in that. But it does fall a little bit to the other two, probably because it's almost too polished for me. Coming in number 2, the album version from Queen 2. The album version from Queen 2 is definitely the most unique out of all of these because there's a lot more studio interplay on this than there is anywhere else in the live versions, the remixes, anything else. A lot of studio trickery that was really kind of cool and innovative in its own way. I do like this version a lot. I thought about putting it on there. I kind of went back and forth a bit. At the day, I'm going to go with the live version from Rainbow of March of 1974. That's the one that's going to take the cake. That's my crown jewel because I love the live interplay. Freddie going out with the audience. Roger's drums are great sound. This is, to me, the definitive version. I'd rather hear this as a live song than a studio song. Some songs feel better in the studio. A lot of Queen songs feel better live, and this is one of those that feel better live. Rainbow, March 1974, the crown jewel of Ogre Battle. So what is my rating from 1 to 11? Because we always turned up to 11 here on PLD Projects. I'm going to slide Ogre Battle in at 9.5, which means it's going to enter my top 10 tracks of all time from Queen so far. We're bumping Earth, the Smile song, out of the list, moving April Lady down to 10th, Keep Yourself Alive down to 9th, Doing All Right down to 8th, Going Back down to 7th, Father to Son down to 6th, and Ogre Battle with a Bullet coming in at number 5, just below Liar, also at 9.5. So there you have it, folks. That's the end of this week's episode. A little bit of housework. I want to thank my patrons, of course, specifically Danielle Ramirez, Brandon Buckingham, Brady Parker, Jeff Alterman, John Lastrina, Kelly W. Patreon.com/PLD Projects. Helps keep the lights on, helps me do these shows. I really, truly appreciate it. I'm going to get some more watch-throughs and some more hangouts going as soon as I can. Hopefully that's going to come up pretty soon. We had a great one just a week and a half ago. That was really fun. Let's keep that going. Of course, I want to thank everybody who listens to it, from patrons to non-patrons. And I'm going to throw out there a few things you can also listen to. On this same feed, I do the Two Mediocre White Dudes on Film with PJ Campbell. We are burning through that Halloween franchise, trying to get to the end before Halloween Ends comes out. We can review that. We just basically take franchises and go through them film by film and talk about them. A lot of fun. Of course, also Class Action on the PLD Project's YouTube channel. Myself, Richard Derek Jarvie, Matty Gunner, sometimes PJ Campbell. We'll take two things, items, movies, actors, franchises, directors, put them up against each other. 5 custom-made categories and put them to the test and see which one comes out on top. That's about it this week, folks. You can find me at Paul_Januzio on Twitter. And leave me a comment, leave it a like, hit subscribe, do all that kind of stuff. Let me know what you think. If you want anything more, anything different, tell me what you want. I'll help you. I'll try to give it to you. That's the kind of guy I am. But of course, until next week, keep on rocking, everybody. God save the